Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire. Episode 119, The Republic of Novgorod. In 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, some Russian anti-war activists created a new flag with white, blue, white stripes. The removal of the red stripe from the Russian tricolour was supposed to represent a rejection of imperialist violence and militarism. It was also claimed to be inspired by the flag of Novgorod. The current flag of Novgorod has two stripes, blue at the base and white at the top, with the city's coat of arms in the middle. But in the 90s it did use the white, blue, white triband, also with the coat of arms in the middle. Like many flags from Eastern Europe, it was supposed to be inspired by the local landscape. In this case, the white walls of the city's ancient Orthodox churches and the blue of the Volkhov River running through the city. But the Russians waving the flag at anti-war protests were inspired by something else. The idea of a different historical pathway, one where the supposed absolutist, authoritarian, imperialist Moscow had not conquered all, and the supposed Republican and democratic Novgorod had continued to flourish and develop into a country that was something more like Alexei Navalny's beautiful Russia of the future. This was not a new idea. The notion of an alternative history in which Novgorod was not annexed by Ivan III, and instead survived to lead Russia towards a political system more like that of Western Europe, democratic, freer, fairer, less aggressive, has been around for a long time. The less aggressive part's completely anachronistic, of course. It's hard to make a serious argument that Russia was ever more aggressive and expansionist than the Spanish or British empires or Napoleon. Western European history is a tale of war and imperialism as well. But as we reach that annexation, it's worth going back to look at Novgorod again. Was it really a democratic republic? We do know that Novgorod, including its predecessor, Gorodishi, was politically different from the very beginning. If you can recall back about 100 episodes, the story was that the Varangians had been taxing the Slavic and Finno-Ugrian tribes of the region, which led to an uprising and the Norsemen being driven out. However, the tribes then turned to fighting among themselves. Not willing to allow each other to become preeminent, they went back to the Varangians for someone who would come and keep the peace. Notably, this leader, Rurik by legend, was not a king. He did not, for example, receive the right to collect taxes in the Novgorod lands. Only the town itself could set taxes, from which they allotted their knyaz a gift, the payment for performing his duties, keeping the peace and defending the town. This arrangement also gives us a tidy explanation for why Oleg and Igor left Gorodishi, breaking their agreement to serve as knyaz for life, and heading south to conquer Smolensk and Kiev. Those restrictions imposed by the people of Novgorod must have chafed, and so they set out to take cities where they would rule by right of conquest, without limitation, not by agreement, and subject to permission. Their departure left Gorodiche without a knyaz, although representatives of the ruler of Kiev remained. The takeover of Kiev stimulated the development of trade, and that encouraged more settlement. Initially, 3 settlements grew up in close proximity. Slavinsky, easy to see that derives from Slav, Nerevsky, from the Nereva Finno-Ugrian tribe, and Ludin, from the Slavonic word for people. It's usually assumed that these settlements reflect the tribes that invited Rurik and his Varangians, but we can't know for sure. Novgorod, the town, with its Kremlin citadel, was formed from these settlements during the campaigns to subjugate the tribes and reform tax administration carried out by Olga of Kiev in the middle of the 10th century. These reforms did not include Novgorod acquiring its own knyaz. It seems likely that neither the local boyars, emerging as a ruling class as trade made the town prosperous, nor the knyazes of Kiev would have wanted one. However, as the ruling family of the Rurikids, or Volodymyrichi, grew, Novgorod became a prize that they all competed for. In the 11th century, Yaroslav became knyaz and stopped paying tribute to Kiev. Novgorod then supported him in his successful campaign to become Grand Knyaz of Kiev, and in return he declared that the boyars of Novgorod were exempt from the knyaz's jurisdiction. As the city grew, the boyars' estates formed the districts known as Ends, which remained outside the jurisdiction of the knyaz. Between the Ends, new districts appeared, settled by merchants and artisans who were subject to the knyaz. At the end of the 11th century, we encounter the first example of the boyars using a right that had not previously been exercised, but which they will have frequent recourse to over the next couple of centuries. When their knyaz, Mstislav Vladimirovich, leaves and sends a replacement, David, the city rejects him and demands that Mstislav returns. In doing so, the boyars cited the original invitation to Rurik, asserting that this established the city's right to choose its own knyaz. At around the same time, the institution of the posadnik was reformed. Posadnik was a term that was generally used for governors, that is, representatives of a knyaz appointed to administer somewhere or other for him. This is what it had been in Novgorod as well, since the knyaz moved to Kiev. However, because Mstislav had been a minor when he was appointed, a posadnik had been elected from among the boyars to assist him. It now became the rule that in Novgorod, the posadnik was a boyar chosen by the city, not by the knyaz. The boyars also imposed a new restriction on the knyaz, prohibiting him from owning private property within the territory of Novgorod. Only the people of Novgorod could own property in the city. By way of emphasis, the court and administration were moved out of Novgorod itself and back into Gorodiche, now a nearby suburb. Each of these reforms led to further reforms. Next, the boyars imposed a limit on the knyaz's right to adjudicate disputes. Where the knyaz had previously been the supreme judge in Novgorod, now a joint court of the knyaz and the posadnik was established. Another decade later, the boyars rose up to throw out Vsevolod and invite Sviatoslav Olegovich of Chernihiv as knyaz. And while they were doing so, they also made it that the knyaz's judgments in court only entered effect when they were confirmed by the posadnik. This effectively made the knyaz an official of the boyars. With each of these steps, the boyars also tried to reduce the knyaz's remuneration, recover lands that had previously been granted to go with the office, and give him less desirable territory in its place. Over the 12th century, the boyars' lands became votchiny, hereditary property that they held in their own right, like the patrimonial lands of the knyazes. Novgorod's territory was poor quality, with little land suitable for farming and few mineral resources. Almost everything it needed was imported. What it had was the vast hinterland where furs, fish, wax, honey, and similar products were gathered. This meant two things. First, that the boyars' estates were concentrated in the town as the most livable area. They needed proximity to the marketplaces and city intrigues, not to their land. Second, as new threats emerged, Lithuania, the Teutonic Order, Scandinavians, but also Tver and Susdalia, they needed to be able to defend these largely sparsely inhabited territories without having a significant peasant population that they could draw on for troops. The three original settlements of the city continued to exist as factions, which allied themselves with different knyazhestva, Suzdal, Smolensk, Chernihiv, and pulled Novgorod into the never-ending conflicts with the rest of Rus. In 1207, the boyars of the Ludin end were in power. Their rivals, allied with Suzdal, overthrew the Ludin end in an armed uprising, expelled their boyars, and redistributed their property. Another major reform around this time was the transfer of the office of the Tisyatnik from the control of the knyaz to the control of the boyar. While the 12th century saw a steady increase in the city's independence and self-governance, the Mongol conquest in the 13th had a major impact on its relations with the knyaz. The initial economic effects of the conquest were severe. Trade and cultural ties were broken, huge payments had to be made. In the city, construction of stone buildings, requiring significantly more capital and organization than timber, was halted for around 50 years. More importantly, the Mongols' position was that it was they who legitimized the rule of any knyaz, including the Grand Knyaz, and that ended Novgorod's tradition that it was free to choose its knyaz. Now, Novgorod was to accept whomever the Mongols granted the Yarlik of the Grand Knyaz. In practice, however, this meant that the Grand Knyaz spent most of his time away from Novgorod, where he appointed his representatives. And thus the outcome was that the Grand Knyaz's role in the city was further reduced, and the boyar system was strengthened. In the 1260s, as the Mongol system became more entrenched, the city concluded a new agreement with Grand Knyaz Yaroslav Yaroslavich, which confirmed that the Knyaz did not have the right to collect taxes, to privately own land in Novgorod, or to issue judgments without the approval of the Posadnik. Towards the end of the century, the Knyaz's rights were further restricted by the creation of a commercial court, headed by the Tisyatnik, one of the boyars, and an episcopal court that had jurisdiction over the increasingly large number of people living on land owned by the church. The Knyaz had no authority in cases that fell within the jurisdiction of these courts. The ecclesiastical court led to further reform. As we've heard, the Mongols had encouraged investment in monasteries through the institution of the Tarkhan and its favourable tax treatment. The monasteries were also growing as a result of bequests and endowments, which we will look at soon. These processes were creating major landholdings, which then acquired populations to work the land, giving bishops temporal power to go with their spiritual authority. However, the Archbishop of Novgorod was appointed by and answered to the Metropolitan in Moscow. The boyars therefore secured the creation of the Archimandrite of Novgorod, an appointee of the boyars based at the monastery of St. George, just outside of town, who had authority over the hegumens, or abbots, of Novgorod. The Veche supervised the secular activities of the Archimandrite and removed him from office if he did not do what he was told. Up to now, we can see that Novgorod is a republic. It's ruled by a boyar oligarchy, but its government has been rather ad hoc and opportunistic. At the end of the 13th century, after several decades of instability, the boyars attempted to stabilize the system and increase representation. Participation in the Veche was extended. The merchants established their own grouping, similar to the districts already existing, represented by another Tisyatnik. The Posadnik, representing the boyars, the Tisyatnik of the merchants, and the Archimandrite were elected annually. Novgorod was entering a new economic boom. The Baltic trade through the city was the main source of the silver that all the knyazhstva used to pay tribute to the Mongols, and to obtain it they all had to trade with the city. This was also the source of the repeated outbreaks of conflict with Tver and Moscow, which also wanted to control the flow of silver. Meanwhile, Lithuania's acquisition of Smolensk also brought it to Novgorod's borders. This led to a complex situation in which some frontier regions of the Novgorod lands were under dual control with the rivals, who defended them against each other. Torzhok and Volokholamsk were under an agreement with Moscow. A peace agreement concluded by Novgorod, Polotsk, Smolensk, the Teutonic Order, and Lithuania required Lithuania to recognize Novgorod's sovereignty in exchange for frontier territory that Mstislav had given to Smolensk a century earlier. When Moscow began to assert its role as overlord of the Rus lands, this naturally escalated the conflict with Novgorod. In the time of Dmitry Donskoy, the city declared that it was no longer under the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan in Moscow. Vasily I, broke Moscow's peace agreement with Novgorod when he launched his campaign to take Volokholamsk and the Dvina lands. 20 years later, the boyars declared that they were taking Vasily's brother, Konstantin, as knyaz instead, although that did not last for long. During this period, the city also adopted the name of Great Novgorod. Although the conventional translation obscures this, the Great here is the same as the Grand in Grand Knyaz, Veliki. The city was declaring itself, as a self-governing republic, to be equal to the Grand Knyaz. However, conflict with Moscow was not the only problem. Historians are comfortable calling Novgorod a republic, but whether it was a democracy is a different matter. Democracy requires representation, not just somebody voting. The boyars and merchants might elect officials, but those officials represented only their backers, hereditary oligarchic clans, not even the boyars as a class. The leader of each of the ends was elected for life. Rivalries over offices repeatedly ended in violence. The reforms we've been discussing led to a consolidation of the boyars as a class. Rather than being end against end, with factions blaming each other, the boyars united against the outside forces threatening them. However, they united as a hereditary oligarchic class, ruling over a growing population that was entirely excluded from government. Representation of the boyars was increased. Now there were 18 posadniks, and the head posadnik, effectively the head of state, was elected twice a year. But this did nothing to calm the growing tension. In 1418, the city erupted into a major anti-boyar uprising. The people pillaged the monasteries looking for grain, which the boyars were exporting for profit while the people went hungry. The boyars were forced to call on the archbishop to restore order, which he did, while laying the blame firmly on the boyars. The number of posadniks was repeatedly increased until more or less every boyar family had its own posadnik. The chronicles from the 15th century on show the two words becoming interchangeable. Although our records are, like for everything else, scant, the boyars were thinking about what form their government should take. Their collegial institution, formed by the posadniks, the tisyatniki, now also expanded to 5, the archimandrite and the hegumens, was becoming something similar to the Senate of the most successful republic of the age, Venice. It's likely that this was intentional, as the city began to mint silver coins showing a kneeling horseman receiving his regalia from St. Sophia. Clearly a copy of Venetian coins showing the kneeling doge receiving his regalia from St. Mark. But the emergence of the boyars as a united ruling class provided the non-privileged strata of Novgorod with a target for their discontent. From the middle of the 15th century, the chronicles constantly lament unjust boyars, the absence of justice, and unfair courts. A small genre of posadniki literature appears, the tale of the posadnik Dobrinya, the tale of the posadnik Shil, and others, each about a greedy and corrupt oppressor. As we've heard recently, Novgorod picked the wrong side in the Moscow Civil War, when it chose to support Dmitry Shemyaka. When Vasily won, the city agreed that it would not support Shemyaka's son Ivan or his ally Ivan of Mazhaisk. Breaking this agreement was the final straw for Moscow. The boyars knew that they had reached a critical point, and they sought an alliance with Ivan III. Took this as the basis for his Novgorod policy, claiming that he was acting because Novgorod was trying to transfer itself into the jurisdiction of Lithuania and to renounce orthodoxy. The first part was true, but the second was not. The draft agreement offered to Kazimierz provided for religious independence and the inviolability of the Orthodox Church. No matter, Ivan marched in defense of orthodoxy and crushed the army of Novgorod at the river Shelon. Speaking to the townspeople, Ivan declared, quote, "You are my patrimony, O people of Novgorod. From the time of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers, from Grand Knyaz Vladimir, who baptized the Russian land, the great-grandson of Rurik, the first knyaz of your land, and from that Rurik, and even to this day, you knew only the lineage of those grand knyazes, first of Kiev, until the Grand Knyaz Vsevolod Yuryevich of Vladimir. Their lineage continues from that Grand Knyaz to me. We own you and reward you and forbid you things from here, and also we will execute you if you start considering us not as in the old days. You have been subjects of no king or Grand Duke of Lithuania since your land was formed." End quote. The boyars who had initiated the alliance with Lithuania were indeed executed, but the boyar government was left intact. 4 years later, Ivan marched on Novgorod again, this time in what the chronicles call a peaceful campaign, triggered by complaints from the people of Novgorod against the boyars. The Muscovite delegation was met along the route by delegations from the city, and Ivan judged their complaints, the chronicles tell us, fairly. Two years after that, in 1477, Ivan marched again, this time with an army. Surviving documents show that he did not actually set out with the intention of subjugating Novgorod. His aim was to formalize the separation of the Dvina lands and their annexation by Moscow. However, this was when the boyars' chickens came home to roost. The people of Novgorod refused outright to fight for the oligarchs and their corrupt regime. Ivan took Novgorod without a struggle. In January 1478, he prohibited the veche and abolished the posadnik as an institution. The bell used to summon the veche was dismounted and taken to Moscow as a symbol of the end of the city's autonomy. To ease the blow, Ivan swore that he would not touch the lands of the boyars. He will not keep that promise. And so, rather ignobly and anticlimactically, Novgorod finally lost its independence after centuries of resistance. The anti-war Russians of today are far from the first dissidents in Russian history to romanticize it as a mythical alternative to repressive imperial and more recent regimes. But as with many such cases, there's not much fact behind the myth. If Novgorod had indeed been democratic, maybe its people would have wanted to defend it, and history really would have turned out differently. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.